Good morning.
We'll give them maybe just one more minute. I think we've got a couple more people that might jump on, and then we'll get started.
Sounds good.
All right, we'll get started. I know there's one staff person here in this office we're gonna resend the link to quick. But I wanted to say good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 National Disability Employment Awareness Month event in the Mitchell community. We're happy you're here with us today, and we're excited to learn from our presenter. First, there's just a couple housekeeping things I want to cover. Should you have any questions, the chat box is located at the bottom of your control panel. You can place your questions in there, and if there's time at the end, Mark will address those. If the questions don't get addressed during this presentation, we'll follow up with you after the event. If you have any technical concerns throughout the presentation today, you can directly message Jessica Sainert in the chat, and she'll kind of help you troubleshoot those. Mark Sternhagen, what if it was me? Presentation will encourage us to think in the perspective of what if we were an individual with a disability. Mark has taught at South Dakota State University for over 30 years. He loves working with computers and is also involved with LifeScape and serves as on their governing board. Mark is a member of the Disability Awareness Committee in the Brookings community. He is currently an SILC member and has spoken as a polio survivor. Mark will share about ADA and its impact both in his personal and his professional life. Last, but most certainly not least, Mark received the 2021 South Dakota Governor's Award for Outstanding Individual with a Disability. Take it away, Mark.
Well, thank you. And thank you for having me. And I'll do my best to address things as we go along. But I do want to start by saying, the idea of what if it was me? And I want you to, as I talk and go through this today, think about it from your own personal perspective. And many of you either are possibly disabled at this point or work with people that are disabled. So you can maybe get some perspective on that. But really, it's about empathy and putting yourself not necessarily in my place, but kind of, and certainly in the place of someone with a disability. And think of it from that perspective, and rather than feeling sorry for somebody or that maybe is disabled or something, but think about it, what about if it was you? And part of that really is that at any point in time, something like 20% of the people in the United States are disabled in one form or another, either permanently or temporarily. And something like 10% are permanently. So it really is not a matter of if it's going to be you, but when. And all of us are going to get to some point in time when access is kind of difficult physically or for other reasons for us. And I think that's part of the reason that people maybe don't do as good a job at access and at things like ADA one of the things too, I will say is we, think about it from the ADA perspective, but realize that ADA is a very, very minimum benchmark. And many of the things in there are just minimum requirements. And I always say access really isn't about ADA, it's about attitude. Having an attitude to do better, to make it easier for everybody, to get everybody to be able to be involved and part of society. And certainly one of the things is many disabled, in fact, maybe most disabled, have this desire or need to be a productive part of society. And that is, I think, a basic instinct in all of us. And often the disabled, some of those instincts are closer to the surface and more maybe meaningful. So think about that as I go along here today. And to start with, I had polio as a child, and that was mentioned. I spent most of my life walking on crutches and with braces and crutches, and currently am confined to a wheelchair. And then that's important to the talk here and to think about as I go along. And polio, just my story and how I got here and how I became this advocate. Polio is a virus. And right now, today is probably one of the important things to talk about, viruses. But polio is a virus, and it's been around for a very long time. It was described in Greek literature in 500 BC or before. So it's been around a good 2,500 years or so. And I will just make a quick mention that it had 2,500 years for natural herd immunity to do something about it, and it didn't. And it just kept getting worse. By the time Jonas Salk came out with the Salk-killed virus vaccine in 1955, there were 185 variants to polio, 3 basic types and 185 variants. As I said, the Salk vaccine came out, actually was certified safe April 12th, 1955. I was born in 1956. And the vaccine was available, but in short supply. And what happened was, when the vaccine came around to my hometown of Scotland, South Dakota, which is just kind of just down the road from Mitchell there, wasn't really a high priority area. And when it did come to town, the vaccine in December, I happened to be running a temp and didn't get vaccinated. The protocol at the time was, if you're running a temp, we don't vaccinate. What we know today about the Salk polio vaccine would say it was probably safe, but they didn't know that then. And a real point, I'm not going to stay on that point for very long about vaccination, but I'm going to say this. Had I been vaccinated for polio, I would not have gotten polio. I would not be here today. I would not have won the governor's award. And my life would have been very different. Now, I honestly feel that I've done fairly well with making the most of what is. And that's part of my message, if you will, is always look to make the most of what is rather than dwell upon what might have been. But again, the fact is, had I been vaccinated, I would not have gotten polio. And, I look back at that and I don't begrudge how my life has turned out. But if I had a chance to go back and get vaccinated, I would in a heartbeat. So, and it does play a little bit about how I became an advocate, because I became an advocate for disability rights started with the measles epidemics a few years ago. And I gave my little basic story about polio and the vaccine, and the blowback that I got on social media told me that maybe my story needed to be told. So anyway, when polio came around in August during the polio weather, in August of 1957, I contracted polio. All of those around me that were vaccinated did not. And So I was about 18 months old. I spent the next year in the hospital between initially at Sacred Heart in Yankton, and then later in a polio ward down in Omaha. I spent some time in an iron lung, which if you want to think about what an iron lung is, I always think about when I see the bulk milk trucks going down the interstate with the shiny stainless steel milk trucks. That's kind of what the iron lungs, to a child, that's what they look like to me. The cab, where the cab on the truck is, would be where the person's head stuck out from the iron lung. I don't recall being in one at all, which is probably good. I do remember seeing people in them. And so it was interesting and when I would sometimes go back to Omaha for therapy or surgery or something like that, some of my friends who I had known when I was there that were in iron lungs, and I'd ask, where was so-and-so? And they would say, well, he went home. And I didn't realize or didn't know until a couple years ago that that was a euphemism for he died. The other thing about iron lungs, last I knew, which was about 2 years ago, there were still 3 people in the United States living in iron lungs who had been living in iron lungs since the 50s. And just imagine what that would be like. Anyway, as I was going along, and if some of you have seen the cover of my book, there's this picture of me. I guess I have one handy here, but if I hold it up, it doesn't show very well. But anyway, I'm wearing this contraption, which is these full braces from my chest to my toes, and I'm using crutches and stuff. And I was about 5 years old, 4 or 5 in that picture. I could walk maybe 5, 6 steps before I had to rest. But I did get past that. I ended up going to public school in Scotland. By that time, I had one single leg brace on my left leg and forearm or stainless steel type, or not steel, I'm sorry, aluminum crutches. And I could get along and walk by myself, do things, go up and down stairs. I didn't really like it that much, but I could do it. And I could handle that. And if you back at that time, though, in public schools, there wasn't a lot of training for any kind of special education. And what there was very basic and simple. And certainly someone like me didn't necessarily fit in well. I didn't really have so much trouble with the kids, but there were some other issues. As I said, I took care of myself. I could go to the bathroom by myself, do everything I needed to do by myself. If I fell, I could probably get back up by myself. If not, my brothers were in the same school and they could usually help me, and that wasn't really a problem. But I did end up with a couple teachers that had a problem. And that maybe is one of my important messages, is it's again, we're back to attitude. I don't exactly blame the teachers of the school too much because there wasn't any training or anything. And certainly there was no ADA, didn't exist, and anything, accommodations made were just simply happenstance more than anything. Kindergarten went good. First grade went pretty well. Second grade, though, I ended up with an older lady, I use that term loosely, teacher that didn't like having me in her class, and I knew that. One of the mistakes that people often make about the disabled is that they're disabled in every other way as well, including that they don't understand things, which is actually very incorrect. In fact, very often disabled of all types are more in tune with certain things like body language and have these innate understandings and notice things that others maybe miss. Part of that, certainly in my case, is because I spent a lot of my life being an observer rather than a participant. and you just get used to that and noticing things and how people are. So there was no question. I knew that she didn't like having me in her class. And I kind of had the bad luck that she had a student teacher that she managed to pass along her prejudices to, that they then hired the next year to teach third grade. And third grade was kind of an important factor because it was on the second floor. There was no elevator or anything, and no accommodations really made or anything like that. There was rules, and one of them was that no passing on the steps. And I was always, even as a child, very cognizant of my disability and being disabled, and tried very hard to not be in anybody's way, to not be a problem, to not be an issue. So since there was no passing on the steps, I would always try to make sure that when I went up, like after lunch, that I got up there early before the bell rang, or waited until after the bell rang and everybody else was pretty much up there. And then I would go up and maybe be a minute or so late or something. Well, this one day in particular, I missed figuring that and got about halfway up the steps and the bell rang. So there's this line of kids forming behind me, and they're all pushing and, and saying, hurry up, and realized that I did walk on crutches and I was fairly good at it, but I had two speeds, slow and really slow. And on going up steps, it was really slow. So I'm going up the steps. We get up to the landing, and this one kid goes running around me, and I grabbed him and threw him against the wall. So then he goes running up and told the teacher. Now, the third grade teacher, my teacher, wasn't in yet, but the fourth grade teacher was. And the fourth grade teacher had known me her whole life. They actually lived behind us for a number of years before they moved out in the country. And she had babysat for myself and my brothers and things like that. She came up and asked, Frank said you threw him against the wall. Did you throw him against the wall? Yes, I did. Why did you throw him against the wall? Well, he passed on the steps. There's no passing on the steps. So she had us both go sit in the classroom and wait. And I could hear them out in the hallway talking and discussing what had happened. And long story short, I ended up staying in from recess the next couple of weeks, and he didn't really get anything for that. And as time was going, I was starting to get more aggressive on fighting back with things. And I walked with, as I said, aluminum crutches, which basically were two aluminum bats that I carried around with me wherever I went. And I knew how to use them. One of the things, if you're walking on crutches your whole life, they become an extension of your arm. And so I was pretty good with them at getting to what I needed to with them. And you can ask my brothers at how well they worked as clubs or bats. And certainly, and I have a story about that too, where my dad had a gas station about 3 blocks from where we lived. And one time my little brother, John, who I call him my little brother, but he's about 6'4" and I'm 5'6", but he's a year younger than me, so he's still my little brother. And he was going, and we're walking home, and he's trying to hurry me up, and he's behind me, and he keeps kicking me in the butt, saying, hurry up, hurry up. And I kept saying, knock it off, and he just wouldn't do it. So finally I said, knock it off, and I swung around with my crutch. And it's probably just as well that I connected with a tree instead of John, because I broke my crutch off right below the handle. And it became kind of a mutual agreement with the school and everything that perhaps I wasn't doing so well in Scotland public schools, which was true. And a decision was made to send me, at the time it was Crippled Children's Hospital and School in Sioux Falls, and many of you are maybe familiar with that. It was later Children's Care Hospital and School, and is now a part of Lifescape. Crippled Children's was originally started for people just like me, polio survivors, to educate and therapy, etc., for polio survivors. So I ended up transferring there in April when I was in third grade, right after Easter. They were full-time school, 20 year-round school, and they just came off their Easter break, and then I went there, which I never kind of considered fair, because here I was just weeks away from getting out of school for the summer in Scotland, and now I got thrust into 3 more months of school. But in any case, I ended up going there. And I will say, I pretty much hated every minute that I was there. I say that, kind of humorously, but in a way I did, and in a way I didn't. But honestly, it wasn't that I hated the place. I hated the fact that I had to be there, that I had to be different, that I had to be this little crippled kid. And I really hated that I had to go there. But looking back, there is absolutely no question in my mind it was the best thing that ever happened to me. And I really don't even want to know where I would be today had I not attended there. I'm pretty sure I would have gotten more aggressive. One of the things that often happens with the disabled is they either become more aggressive or more withdrawn. And in either case, it's not good. Now, this was, again, before mainstreaming, before any training or anything like that. So, I'm not really blaming the Scotland school system so much, because they didn't really know, and they didn't know what they needed to do. They just were trying to provide an education. But going to Crippled Children's was, again, it saved me. And there was a lot of real advantages to that. And I think that sometimes we discount that advantage, because with mainstreaming, and nothing against mainstreaming, I think mainstreaming is great. In particular, it's great for the quote normal people, because they get to be around disabled people and see them and realize that they're just people and they're just another kid in many ways. But I'm not always convinced that it's 100% the best for the disabled person. I truly believe that being in an environment like Lifescape or Crippled Children's at the time is really a good thing for the disabled for a lot of reasons. And there are things that are being done now that I think are really good, like camps and things like that, where you can get together with a number of other disabled. But I really can't discount the real kind of being around a true peer group. And the value of that is really hard to deny. I look at it, and we all get these feelings. Everybody gets these feelings, why me, whatever it is. And it's quite often some simple little thing. And it's certainly easy for a disabled person to get that why me feeling, to look out and go, why did I have to be the person that has to deal with crutches and braces and all of these things that go with that, or whatever the disability is? Why me? And it's pretty easy for us to all get that, and certainly for the disabled. But a place like Crippled Children's, I could look around any day when I was feeling why me, and see 100 other kids, many of them in arguably worse condition or worse circumstances than me, who were getting by, who were laughing, having a good time maybe, but getting by and doing okay. And I could look at them and think, well, if they can do it, I can do it. And there were some things that we could do that you couldn't do normally. For example, that pushed each other. Maybe you'd be watching TV and your friend would get up to go get a pop or something, and you'd say, get me one while you're up. And your friend would say back, get it yourself. What are you, crippled? And the thing is, normally that'd be a pretty mean thing to say, but kids say those kind of things to each other. But even for a normal kid to maybe say that to someone like me is kind of mean. And it was mean to each other. I mean, I'll admit that, but it was okay because you both were. So it was okay to say things like that. And sometimes you need that. But there were also other things that we could do for each other, to push each other, to drive each other to be more independent. One of the stories that always comes to mind is I had a friend who actually from Brookings who had been in a carbon monoxide poisoning incident with his family. It's kind of a sad case, but it's kind of carbon monoxide poisoning was kind of like a stroke, and he couldn't really use his right arm very well at all, or almost not at all. He could walk, but he did drag his right leg, and he had speech problems and things like that, some brain damage along with that, which got much better through time. But when he was initially at Crippled Children's, he would always try to get somebody to button his shirt for him because, and he would say, you know, when he'd ask, button yourself, he'd say, I only one hand, I can only use one hand. And so I taught myself to button my shirt left-handed with only my left hand. And I am about as not left-handed as you can be and still have a functioning left hand. So I purposely took time and taught myself to do that. So next time he said that, I said, yeah, I see what you mean, Keith. And I buttoned my shirt only with my left hand. Now, Keith wasn't too happy about that, but that day he went to OT and he got them to teach him to button his shirt with only his left hand. So those are the kind of things that you could do for each other that normally you couldn't. And, you know, just like, you know, what are you crippled thing? Now, I won't say that my brothers never said that to me, but they always said it. They made sure they were out of crutch range when they said things like that. But again, these are the kind of things that could happen there, not to mention a targeted education. Now, then at that time, there wasn't so many IEP type things, more they had, you know, K-12 regular classes and things like that. One of the nice things about being there was that there were things that they could do, though they were a much more flexible school. And along about when I was in 5th grade, and at that time, the standardized testing were the old Iowa basics. And when they did the testing and I took my Iowa basics, I tested way above the other 2 students in my class. I tested at 8th and 9th grade levels, and in some reading comprehension, for example, I was in the 10th grade level because I read all the time. And they decided that the best thing for me was to skip 6th grade, which was something that you could do there. And I will have to say that another teacher that probably didn't appreciate me in her class so much, but it was for different reasons, when I was then jumped to 7th grade. And to just tell you, I was not a great kid, okay? I was kind of a brat. And in 7th grade, the teacher, and she taught most of the basic subjects, our homeroom, if you will. And in math wasn't really her thing so much. And I remember the first time she made an error in the math, and I said something right early on and she said, I know what I'm doing. I'm the teacher. You know, I said, you made a mistake there. And she's like, so after that, I always waited, and she'd get to the end, and she had this habit. She'd have the answer on the board and she'd look at her teacher's book, and in the answer in the back would be different. And she would say something like, oh, the teacher's manual must be off. And I would say, no, Mrs. Tressler, back over there, you made a mistake. That should have been a minus and you had it as a plus or something like that. So she didn't really appreciate me, but it was definitely different than at Scotland Public Schools. The skipping 6th grade factors into my story because I went through and, you know, and when I say that I hated every minute at Crippled Children's, that's not really true, because we did a number of things that you could do there. I was in Boy Scouts. We went camping all the time and did things we probably should have done. You know, I remember one time we were out camping, and it was they have an area down by Lake Brant, down by Madison or by Chester, really. We were out there one time, and it was some rough weather like we get in South Dakota. So it was raining pretty hard and storming and everything. And we didn't have any, nobody had a transistor radio that worked, as I recall. So we're just kind of doing whatever. Our tent got flooded out. So we went and got into the bus. Now the scout leader and the other staff members that were there, their tent was high and dry. And they also had a couple of students that were quadriplegics, and they were in that tent and they were high and dry. So they were just over there sleeping. And we're in the bus and we're looking out to the west, and we see 3 tornadoes out there moving around. And we're watching them, and they're like, well, they're kind of going northwest. So we'll just, and it's dry, nice and dry in the bus. So we'll just kind of stay here. Well, one of the administrators from the school comes out there a little bit later, and he's going nuts. Where's the scoutmaster and stuff? And we said, well, he's over there in his tent sleeping. Don't you guys know it's storming? There's a tornado warning. Yeah, in fact, we saw 3 of them over there. And so he wasn't real happy about that. Kind of led to some issues and problems. But again, it was kind of things that maybe kids would do. It wasn't real bright and smart, but we did it. Anyway, I ended up graduating from Crippled Children's in 1973. And I went to, with the help of vocational rehab, I went to the University of South Dakota at Springfield before it was a prison. And I will say that one of the things to note is back then, the drinking age for 3-2 beer was 18. And carding people and stuff wasn't as big a deal as it should have been and as it is now. And certainly in small towns, and like in Springfield, if you had a student ID, they assumed you were 18. And because I'd skipped 6th grade, I was full on 17. And so basically, if I had found found the classroom as much as I found the bar, I would have done fairly well, but I didn't. And that is one of the negatives coming out of Crippled Children's. They had a very structured environment there. They pretty much tried to know where you were 24/7. I will say that my goal in life was to not have them know where I was whenever possible. But, lunch was at a certain time and you were there, you didn't have a choice. And breakfast and dinner, and you went to bed at a certain time, and all kinds of things like that. So skipping school was, I won't say I never did, but pretty rarely. It was pretty tough because they would always know where you were. Well, when you go to college, it's not like that. It doesn't seem like anybody cares where you are anytime. And I kind of went a little bit nuts. I thought it was very cool that I was 17 and I could go to the bar and drink and nobody cared, and which was not a good thing. So after a couple of years, by kind of mutual agreement, we separated. Now I was in electronics technology, and I actually did fairly well in my electronics classes. I was very interested in it. I made it to most of the classes. I did pretty well. And honestly, in electronics, I was better than average. I was at least as good as pretty much anybody else coming along, but I didn't have the degree. And of course, I thought I knew everything, and I didn't need that. I knew my electronics, and that's all that mattered. I went out and looked for jobs, applied a number of places, and very often I was at least as good as the next person coming along, but guess what? They hired the next person coming along every time. And we can make all the laws, and again, that was still pre-ADA, but even with ADA, we can make all the laws we want, but practicality is that it was easier to hire the next person coming along, and so they did. And that's also something, to think about right now with the way that things have been the last couple of years. The disabled are often the last hired, and the first, I won't say fired, because many it's laid off because of budgets and things like that, but often the first in that way regard too. But also I do really believe that the disabled make some of the best workers, often because they have something to prove. I certainly did. And it was something to prove, if only to myself. And if I had ever been given a chance during that time at a decent job, I know I would have done well, but I was never even given a chance. After a couple years of kind of floundering around, and voc rehab did help me some also with that. And I tried to do my own television and servicing repair shop. This was prior to computers, of course. And that didn't go very well. So after a few years, I decided that I needed to get an education and I needed to do better. I went back to the University of South Dakota at Springfield again before it was a prison. And at first I just took a couple of night classes, but I went to class every time. And the classes I took were for FCC rules and regulations. And the end result, or what we wanted as an end result from that class, was to take the FCC, Federal Communications Commission's radio telephone exam. It's a very hard, difficult exam. And that was the goal of these classes, was to prepare you for that exam. Well, they offered the exam in Sioux Falls, and I went and took the exam with the rest of the students in the class. And my math at the time was kind of weak, because those were the part of the classes that I had blown off when I was going to college before. So I memorized formulas in all different forms and stuff, because I didn't know how to manipulate them. So I memorized them in different forms. And I memorized this great big thick book called a Q&A manual. So I went and took the test. To pass the test, you had to have a 75. And I got dead on 75 out of 100. And I was very proud of myself for having accomplished that, because about half of the students who were regular students going for the full, going to class, had the math and everything like that, over half of them didn't pass. So that fall, with my mother's help, I went back started going. I took 3 classes in the fall. And again, I made sure I went to class all the time. I also started working at the college radio station, which was a very interesting experience. After that first semester back, voc rehab actually found me and said, we see that you're going to the University at Springfield again, and wondering what we can do to help. And so I ended up driving. I stayed at home, and I actually worked some in my mom's dry cleaners as a clerk. And I drove to Springfield, and I did ride with somebody else and stuff, but they did pay for the credits and the school part. And about that time, as I was doing fairly well, I was on a dual track for VTTE, vocational technical teacher education, and electronics technology, working on bachelor's degrees in both. The governor at the time, later convicted felon, decided that we needed more prisons than we needed educational facilities, and they closed Springfield down. And that was a unique experience, which really taught me a lot about politics. I was working at the college radio station at the time, and there was a lot of things that I learned about the insides and the outs of that. In fact, the day that they were voting to close it down, I was running the board. I was on the air that whole day from 7 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock that night, playing stacks of records. And I always remember when I was working in the radio station, I always convinced myself, it's a college radio station, nobody's really listening anyway, so just go and do it. Well, that day, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I decided I probably should grab some lunch. And I put on an album and ran down to the local Casey's and drove down to the Casey's. And I had the radio station on in my car, so just in case something happened, I could get back quick and take care of it. And I remember going into Casey's, and the same song was playing on the radio there that had been playing in my car. And I was like, wow, that's an odd coincidence. And then I realized, wait, they're listening to me. And that was kind of a mind-blowing thing to actually have that happen. Anyway, they voted to close Springfield. They transferred one of my programs to Madison. The VTTE went to Madison. The electronics technology went to SDSU up here in Brookings. But they didn't decide on that until midsummer. And by then I decided I wasn't going to stop my education. I needed to do something. I transferred to USD over in Vermillion in their teacher ed department. I was looking to be a math teacher, but while they accepted all of the credits from Springfield, they were as electives only. So I had 150 some credits, but I was a first semester sophomore in that program. It was not possible to complete and have voc rehab pay for my tuition and stuff. So I ended up transferring to going to Dakota State in Madison for a year and SDSU here in Brookings for a year. As I said, the BTTE, the vocational technical teacher education, was in Madison, and electronics at SDSU. I graduated on Saturday from SDSU with a bachelor's in electronics, and Sunday from Dakota State with a bachelor's in education. I went on to earn a master's degree in industrial management at SDSU. And as was previously stated, I taught there for 33 years. But even then, you know, some of the things that were mistakes on my part, probably the biggest mistake on my part was that I wasn't the disability advocate that I should have been. That I didn't push the ADA rules and things at SDSU, that I didn't make a point about things. Because one of the things is I said early on about being cognizant of being disabled. I never wanted that to be a problem. I never wanted that to be used as something to make a difference unless I didn't have a choice. I tried to fade that into the background whenever possible. I had many people tell me, well, I don't think of you as being disabled. And then I've always like, well, then I guess I did my plan was. But of course, I always had to think about myself as being disabled. I always had to think about ways around things and how to get around obstacles of all sorts. But I didn't want to make a point of that, and I should have. I was faculty. There wasn't a lot they could do to me. And I should have made that point. And I did have things happen that, come to mind. It wasn't that long ago, as when I was walking was getting difficult for me. And what I would do is I kept a wheelchair at my office, and then I had one that I carried around in my car. But what I would do is I asked if the office staff could bring my wheelchair down. I would call when I got there in the morning. They could bring my wheelchair down, and then I could get in it and go and do my stuff in my classroom and stuff. And they're like, sure, that's not a problem. We can do that. And my office was at Solberg Hall, and it happened to be on the side of the building where the people from HR could see. And someone there had a problem with that and told my department head that they were not allowed to help me with the wheelchair because they said it could be a legal issue, which is complete BS because suppose I fell and sued them. Well, South Dakota and SDSU have sovereign immunity, and I couldn't sue them for anything more than the liability insurance they carried or didn't carry. And that's a fact. And they should have known that. But also, and they said that, and that was a thing. And my department head said that they had said that, but she said, we'll still do it for you, but we're really not supposed to. Well, then about a year later, we were going through my review and said that HR has told us again that we cannot keep doing this, that we cannot bring the wheelchair. And they weren't helping me get in and out of the wheelchair. They were just bringing the wheelchair down. I got into the wheelchair, and then when it was time to go in the end of the day, I would call them again. I would meet them down there, and they would take the wheelchair back up and put it in my office. That's what they did. And I thought, I think that that's something that's reasonable to ask, and that shouldn't be a problem. And they said, well, we cannot do it anymore. And, that's not going to happen anymore. That day, I went online from my office at SDSU and looked at the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, I think, and found that it said that they needed to make reasonable accommodations for me as an employee. And bringing a wheelchair down to me was certainly reasonable. Well, I got home that afternoon and I called my lawyer, who I've known for years, and I actually do their computer work. And I said, this is what they said. And he basically quoted what I had looked up on EEOC and said that they are required by law to make reasonable accommodations. I emailed my department head and said, I've talked to an attorney, and I sent the link from EEOC, and they said, this is what they said, and I think that HR is wrong. An hour later, I get an email from HR saying you need to fill out this form and then everything's cool. I should not have had to do any of that. I should not have had to contact an attorney. That shouldn't have happened. First off, it's an employee thing, but also they should have known that in HR. That's their job to know these things. And whether they did and are just incompetent, or I mean, did and didn't care, or didn't and are incompetent, either way, that's something they should have known, but certainly before they said anything to me about it. And I will say that very often things like that get slipped by. It is hard as a disabled person to advocate for yourself. Certainly hard for me. I find it much easier to advocate for others than to advocate for myself. And that's just how it is. And so I don't think that they should have ever even said anything to me. And I will also say SDSU has a lot to be desired when it comes to ADA. They are not in compliance in many places, and I keep hammering at them, and they get by with it because they get by with it. And it's sad, but it's how it is. And that's really too bad. And it's too bad for a number of reasons, because why aren't there more disabled, certainly physically disabled, going to SDSU? One of the things I think that we often miss when we look at education for disabled is many physically disabled will excel at academics. And often they're channeled into the technical fields, which is fine. I mean, I wanted to be in electronics anyway, and that's kind of my thing. But very often they would do much better in areas where they're using their brains rather than their physical body. And SDSU, there are almost every major up there should be available to physically disabled people, and many other disabilities as well. But the physical barriers are there and remain. And, many times they are not in compliance with ADA, and certainly I don't see places where they're going above and beyond, and that's really too bad. So as and I'm teaching and I'm going through all my things and getting by. I am an ultra nerd, if you can see behind me, all this computers and stuff. When I was at Lifescape or Crippled Children's, there was this one time then when I remember that I could smell shrimp cooking, and the deep fried shrimp, which was a favorite of mine when I was a kid. And we get to lunch and we get some god awful tuna casserole or something. I'm like, what happened to the shrimp? And they said, oh, the board of directors got that. They're meeting today and they always get something like shrimp or something like that. And so always after that, I thought of them as the shrimp eaters. And a few years ago, I was coming back from Fargo, with my cousin Mary, who lives in Sisseton, and we had gone to Red Lobster. and had shrimp, of course, which is again my favorite. And I'm coming back, and after I dropped her off at Sisseton, I'm driving back and I'm thinking, well, today I was a shrimp eater. And then I got thinking, you know what? Why can't I be? In other words, why can't I be on the board of directors at Crippled Children's or Children's Care at the time? And maybe I should be. Maybe that's something that I should do. So I contacted them and they said, you know, right now is not a bad time because we're merging and forming Lifescape, and we're actually looking for a couple of new board members. I went down and toured, and what a surreal experience to go through the school, which is still there, right across from the Veterans Hospital. And so much of it was different, and yet so much of it was the same. And the memories flooding back and all of the things from then. Anyway, they ended up asking me to be on the board. And I consider that a real gift, to be able to be on the board, to be able to see things from that other perspective, to see it from the top down and realize that they really care and that they're really trying very hard to do the best for the people that they serve and for their other employees as well, that are all part of this big family kind of a thing. And I look back and as I'm thinking, you know, as a rotten kid that I was, because I have this one, I have to tell you that this showed just how rotten I was. Any of you, some of you that are maybe, you know, a little bit older, but you've all heard of Woodstock sometime. And that was at that point in time. And in Woodstock, there was this something called the fish call, which was they're out yelling, give me an F, give me a U. You can kind of fill in the rest of the blanks on that. And they're yelling it at Woodstock. Well, we're doing that up in the front lobby of Crippled Children's on a Sunday evening at the top of our lungs. There's like 5 of us. And one of the kids was Greg, and he was nonverbal. And this was before computers and electronics and stuff. So he had a lap board with a typewriter keyboard printed out on. And I just muted myself. That's what he would do he's spelling out, give me an F, give me a U, and he's spelling it out on his board as we're going. And at the end, they yell out, what's that spell? And you yell out what it spells. And we're up there doing that. And the nurse that happened to be working, that was a charge nurse that night, was probably the most religious one that we had. And she comes running up there, and I have never in my life seen anybody so mad. Her face was just red. And she's like, what are you guys doing? I'm going to wash all of your mouths out with soap. And I said, well, then you're going to have to wash Greg's hand off too. And she busted out laughing. But that's the kind of real things that we did there and that you could do, and to be just a kid like everybody else. But again, looking back, I'm surprised that they didn't lock me in a room someplace and throw away the key, that my bones aren't rattling around down there somewhere, because I really, looking back, I was that rotten. But I know now they understood. I didn't hate them. I didn't hate the place. I hated it. I hated the fact that I had to be disabled. And it took me a long time to really even realize that's what it was. But looking back again, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. And, I hope that in my story, you found some things that will give you something to think about, and think about it from your own personal perspective and maybe do better. And if anybody has any questions, I certainly will try to answer if I can. I know there was a couple things in the chat, but I think they were just comments more than anything.
Yes, there's no questions in the chat. So if anybody has any, you can unmute yourself and ask. Otherwise, we will be done.
Well, and I will say, feel free to buy my books. We didn't really get into that too much, but my go to my website, www.normalforme4.com, and that will link you to my website, my book. And then there's Sandy and Me, which you can link to that off of that website. They're available on Amazon. I see a couple of names here that are familiar, and a couple of you actually have the book. And so, or you can share them. Although, you could just buy one, but they're only $10 for the Normal for Me, for the autobiography, and $5 for the other one. But I'm not in it to make money, and I certainly am not. So, but I do believe my story has a lot to share with anybody. So also, if anybody has other places that I can speak to or anything, please get a hold of me. I'm happy to do it anytime. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, there's a lot of comments coming in talking about loving hearing your journey, continue to share and advocate. Love hearing your personal experiences. They're inspiring. All kinds of good nuggets in the comments. And then anybody that's local here in Mitchell, just want to let you know that at 1 p.m. today, we're going to meet at Mitchell Christian High School to present our Cal Schultz Awards in person. So if you're available and you're able to make it, 1 p.m. at Mitchell Christian High School. All right. Well, thank you again, Mark, for sharing. It was a wonderful presentation, and it was great to hear your story.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a wonderful day, guys.